Hello and welcome to Toyer Talk. Today we will focus on the topic of housing, and especially housing in the Midwest. David, can you tell me why housing, especially in the Midwest, is so important?
Well, housing is shelter, and obviously that's a basic need for all of us, no matter where you're located. In the Pacific Northwest, though, housing affordability is probably their largest issue, as well as homelessness. And so they're always looking for ways to reduce the cost of housing, to give more people an opportunity to own a home, as well as they're looking for ways to kind of very creatively address the homelessness problem and getting folks into sufficient housing besides, basically living outside in a tent. In the Midwest, the issue with housing is threefold. It's an issue of age, and so you've got a lot of communities where 70 or 80% of their housing inventory was built 30 or more years ago. There's also disconnect between the inventory and expectations, and so whereas before it may have been okay for somebody to buy a house with 3 bedrooms and 1 bath, folks tend to nowadays look for a 3-bedroom house that has 2 baths, just because they don't want to share bathrooms amongst 3 or 4 family members when everybody's trying to hustle out the door in the morning. And the third issue is development costs. And so what we see is that the development costs tend to be a little higher in the Midwest than some other places. And so unless you get sufficient density or there's some sort of an offset to those development costs, it's really hard to provide a home at kind of a level of affordability for the workforce in the Midwest. And so that's a critical issue. The other thing with the Midwest and housing is that population growth in the Midwest has been pretty flat in most places, and in some places it's been declining. And so as those locations from an economic development perspective want to encourage more population in their communities to attract new workers in and hopefully continue to attract new businesses to invest there, they really have to address their housing challenges, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to get past being kind of stagnant from a growth perspective.
Can you describe types of incentives communities give market rate housing projects?
Incentives come in a lot of forms, and they can be really directed to either the buyer or the developer. Some cases, communities do both. So an example would be tax increment financing, which is where a community will allow a developer to get a rebate on future property taxes paid by the new homes to offset the cost of their infrastructure. And so they don't get upfront money, but they basically get a back-end incentive that helps them defray some of their costs of constructing those homes. Another example of an incentive that is more buyer-based would be tax abatement. And tax abatement basically says that for a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year period of time, the jurisdiction won't collect property taxes on that new home. And so the homeowner will realize that savings when buying a house. And so that can often be an incentive, just like cash back when buying a car. There's also other types of incentives that communities can pursue. Sometimes in the Midwest, they'll do their own subdivisions. There's obviously more risk in that for a community because they're outlaying a lot more capital. And so we really look at that as being a difference in incentives policy between foregoing future revenues, which is like what tax abatement and tax increment financing do, versus spending basically general fund dollars and investing in housing itself. And so in those particular cases, you're actually putting capital at risk versus just foregoing revenue that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
That's a lot of great information. Has Toyer Strategic completed any housing studies?
Yes, we did a study this last year on incentives that looked at the state of Iowa, and we generated a report for the communities that participated in the study to allow them to take a look at what their peers are doing from an incentives perspective. We also have the capabilities to help communities take a look at their housing inventories and understand what they have and don't have, to do some housing needs assessments on how much inventory they may need for the future to encourage sufficient population growth to keep up with economic development. And finally, we can really help communities take a look at their zoning codes and standards to see where making some simple changes in what it is that they allow can help them encourage new housing to be created. For example, if the costs are prohibitive to encourage a developer to come in and build housing because they feel that they're not going to be able to hit a price point people can afford. In many cases in the Midwest, folks are building on pretty large lots, and so just simply allowing developers to shrink the size of the lot, even by just a little bit, through reduced setbacks or other things like that, it enables the developer to add a couple of additional units to a project, spread those costs out, and ultimately create a project that has a lower price point.
Remember, if you have a question for Toyer, you can tweet it to #ToyerTalk, post it on our Facebook page, or send us an email. Join us soon for another Toyer Talk.